A Russian diplomat might say that a new era is upon us. The United States is working hard to cling to its fallen position as a global hegemon, and we see its support of actions running counter to international law in Palestine, its malicious provoking of the People's Republic of China in the South China Sea, and its conniving with Kyiv to sow international discord. The Russian Federation, more than any other, wants the conflict on the territory of our near neighbor to be resolved through peaceful and sustainable means, in consistency with the Minsk agreements approved by the Security Council. Unfortunately, the anti-Russian approaches of the West and within United Nations forums are demonstrative that Kyiv's intentions are the opposite, with its concerted effort to exacerbate internal conflict as much as possible in an attempt to secure international assistance in its fight against its own population. Ukraine has unjustly become a hostage of the Kyiv regime and its Western masters who have effectively occupied the country. The country's authorities use any opportunity possible to draw the attention of the international community away from their role in the hostilities in Donetsk and Luhansk, victimizing themselves and attempting to avert responsibility at the cost of thousands of lives. The Russian Federation did not unleash this war, despite the West's proclivity for apportioning the blame to Russia. The Kyiv regime unleashed the war in the Donbass region in 2014. This war, as it continues, is an existential threat to the world. The Russian Federation implores the Kyiv regime and the West to liberate the people of Ukraine rather than trying to inflict a strategic defeat to Russia and transform the local conflict into a global confrontation. Was the conflict avoidable? So the Western narrative is that Putin was bent on restoring the lost might of the Soviet Empire, invading to fulfill a desire of land, power, and glory, but this is simply not the case. Russia, or the Russian Federation, would say that the conflict was not avoidable. It began with conflict in the Donbass region in 2014, when Kyiv government forces fought separatists trying to regain their sovereignty in the region. Additionally, Russia was and is simply acting in self-defense against NATO's eastward march. Russia believes that NATO is a tool of American imperialism, and we see American imperialism all over the world. The difference is that Americans are not called out for such imperialism in the way that non-Western countries are. NATO is simply an anti-Soviet accord signed following World War II. Its maintenance of an eastward expansion has absorbed the security belt of Moscow, provoking Russia, Russia would say intentionally, damaging its security interests and forcing it to act in self-defense. The US government under George Bush suggested that if Germany became a NATO member, NATO would stop expanding. Moscow demolished the Warsaw Pact, which involved the countries highlighted in red, as a result of this misleading and deceptive suggestion made by the United States. NATO continued to expand. Now, the US denies this suggestion, but there are many documents and memos refuting their argument. Putin remarked at a 2007 conference in Munich that NATO has put its frontline forces on our borders. This expansion represents a serious provocation that reduces the level of mutual trust, and we have the right to ask, against whom is this expansion intended? And what happened to the assurances our Western partners made after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact? There are various high-ranking US diplomats and professionals who have commented on this. George Kennan, an American diplomat and historian that was the father of the Cold War containment strategy regarding NATO expansion, said that, "I think it is a tragic mistake. There was no reason for this whatsoever. No one was threatening anybody else." Jack Matlock, who is in the top right of the slide shown, said that in denying that Russia has a right to oppose extension of a hostile military alliance to its national borders, the United States ignores its own history of enforcing a sphere of influence. Russia has been clear for a long time that dropping support for Ukraine's eventual entry could have averted the invasion. Now, the Russian and Ukrainian militaries are paying with their lives for the United States' reckless flirtation with Ukraine as a future NATO member. Western governments had an excessive desire not to lose face by compromising with Russia. Looking at briefly the tactics and strategy involved, I'll only touch on a couple. But Russia's strategy has revolved around returning Russia's lands and uniting its people from involvement with Georgia and the 2014 annexation of Crimea. So this has been quite a long time in the making. Russia is employing a strategy of escalating to de-escalate, meaning pain in the short term, but for long-term gain and less lingering pain in the long term. Various aspects of digital war and technology have been involved with the military operation in the Ukraine region. Russia believes that Western countries were complicit in the sabotage, for example, of the Nord Stream undersea gas pipeline in 2022. Russia was blamed for this, but we hold the position that it was not our forces that did that damage. The former Russian president, Dmitry Medvedev, commented that following this sabotage by the West and its allies, we have no constraints, even moral, left to prevent us from destroying the ocean floor cable communications of our enemies, which may be a tactic that we see employed more and more in the future. Relating to its testing of direct ascent hit-to-kill anti-satellite or ASAT technology, Russia has historically tested counter-space weapons to provide a means to restore strategic stability. Russia is using the cutting-edge future weapon system to strengthen Russia's deterrent and defense against US attempts to attain comprehensive military advantage in space. Russian leaders believe that the next generation of warfare could be waged in the aerospace domain, utilizing weapons enabled and focusing on satellite targeting and navigation. There is great potential for a future war in which significant air missile strike campaigns could be mounted against Russia, hence Russia's preparedness in this event. Looking at the consequences of the conflict in Ukraine, the International Criminal Court has alleged that the crimes committed in Ukraine constitute reasonable grounds to believe that Mr. Putin himself bears individual criminal responsibility. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov was correct in naming these accusations as outrageous and unacceptable, elaborating that Russia does not recognize the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, as it is not party to the Rome Statute. He noted that any decisions of this kind are null and void for the Russian Federation from the point of view of law. Russia bears no obligations under the International Criminal Court. The West continues to argue that Russia has committed various war crimes against Ukraine. And to disprove this, we need to take a holistic and reasonable view of international law. The principle of jus ad bellum is the right to go to war under international law. Russia has maintained the right to use force against Ukraine under Article 51 of the UN Charter, which preserves the rights of UN member states to defend themselves against an armed attack and to engage in collective self-defense. Russia may, under international law, use force against Ukraine to defend the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, which Russia recognizes as independent states. Russia also had a right to engage in military operations on humanitarian grounds to protect Russian speakers in the Donbas region. It's ironic to hear criticism from the West, particularly the United States, for Russia protecting her interests when considering interventions by the United States and its allies in multiple wars over history, including the Iraq War, the Libyan crisis, the Syrian Civil War, the war in Kosovo. The list goes on, and the hypocrisy is astounding. The second principle of jus in bello discusses how actors should conduct themselves in the midst of fighting. Again, this is not relevant to the Russian Federation under the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. However, Russia has remained within the parameters set by this principle, and no solid evidence that remains untampered with by the Western propaganda machine indicates otherwise. Looking at potential for resolution and peace processes. So in terms of a timeline for potential resolution, some analysts, particularly US analysts, believe that the war is heading toward an outcome benefiting the United States and Ukraine due to Ukraine's purported battlefield momentum, arguing that the risks of Russian nuclear use or the involvement of NATO are manageable. Russia is realistic. Our enemies are trying to compromise peace processes and drag out the conflict in Ukraine in order to exhaust Russia and her resources. And we cannot let this happen. Russia would like to see the conflict end peacefully. However, due to the meddling of the West, a short-term end to the conflict is unlikely. And I'll pass on to Jevon.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll be discussing the Russia-Ukrainian war from the perspective of Ukraine. So good afternoon, everyone. As a representative of Ukraine, I would like to say that the atrocities that the Russian Federation has continued to conduct in our territory has not only violated Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, but also the Budapest Agreement that Russia signed in 1994, which they explicitly mentioned that they will refrain from the use of force that will affect the territorial sovereignty of Ukraine. So therefore, I proceed with the opening perspective from Ukraine. So you can see that from February 2022, Russia had invaded Ukraine, and Ukraine has tremendously reduced the forces of Russia in its territory, as you can see over time. And we want to first understand, why is it that Russia is conducting these attacks on Ukraine? Why has Russia chosen to invade Ukraine? So the first perspective is the Russian imperialism. Russia is an empire, and empires are not good at fading away. We can see the current new imperialist nature of Russia. Russia still continues to influence post-Soviet countries. They claim exclusive rights to interfere with these countries. And we see over time, Russia continuing to intervene in post-Soviet countries that are seeking to pivot to the West. It's happening in our country, in Ukraine. It has happened in Estonia, Georgia. We've seen Russian imperialism happening over and over again. This reflects this current neo-imperialistic nature of Russia. Putin says that states such as Ukraine are not fully sovereign, and therefore they must respect the restrictions that Russia put on them, which is in blatant violation of UN Charter, which reflects self-determination. Another aspect is Russian nationalism. The official state media discourse is that the annexation of Crimea was to undo justice of the creation of a border separation of Russians and to unite the Russian community. Russian also mentions that they are intervening because of humanitarian reasons. This is a blatant disrespect of our sovereignty and territorial integrity. President Putin aims to rebuild what he claims is a Russian empire. He is still obsessed with the Soviet Union, and he calls it the great political catastrophe of the 20th century. He puts forward this nationalistic view, and on his recent essay on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, he claims that Ukraine is part of Russia, which it is not, and that Ukraine is indivisible from Russia. So why does Russia invade Ukraine? Why do they think it's important? So first, Russia says, okay, there's Russian diaspora and familial ties that Russia has with Ukraine. They claim it's historically and culturally important for Russia. That is their rationale. They also want to invade other countries because they have historically prioritized strategic depth and buffer zones as a defense strategy. So if you look at this map of the region around Russia, Russia claims that, hey, we do not want the West close to our borders. So they want to be in control or have influence over the states nearby. However, I must emphasize again the right of self-determination of states. After the disintegration of the Soviet Union, there was a creation of the CIS, the Commonwealth of Independent States, and it was basically a buffer or a guardrail using strategic depth to protect Russia. But once again, every country has a right to self-determination. So was the conflict avoidable? No. We've seen that based on Russia's imperialistic nature, nationalism, and the strategic importance that Russia claims, they have always had this latent ability or want to invade Ukraine. It was just only a matter of time that they did. Russia is indeed the aggressor. Ukraine, going on about its business, as a sovereign nation, has the right to determine how to conduct its foreign policy. Russian invasion of Ukraine is premeditated and an unprovoked act of aggression. And once again, Ukraine asserts its right to self-determination. The tactics and strategy, Russia has been using many strategies against Ukraine, such as hybrid warfare, using both conventional military tactics as well as cyber tactics. However, the Ukrainian government has been using digital tools and also conventional weapons to defend itself from this attack from Russia. Consequences? Well, we see that it's a clear violation of international law. Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, of which Russia is a signatory, prohibits the threat or use of force, respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the political independence of other states. Sanctions has been levied against Russia, and the continued action in eastern Ukraine raises questions about sovereignty and territorial integrity, not only for Ukraine, but for Europe and the entire world. The UN Security Council has proposed resolutions. However, Russia has consistently vetoed these resolutions. There's a humanitarian crisis occurring in eastern Ukraine, and there's a rise in energy prices across Europe. Resolution: Russia wants the territory which they claim is there. However, Ukraine reaffirms its right to control its own territory, and we seek a peaceful resolution. We're willing to compromise some autonomy. However, we respect territorial integrity. We are willing to undertake diplomatic talks. However, while doing so, there must be respect for our territorial integrity. We need a resolution that ensures stability and security for all parties, however, while respecting Ukraine's territorial sovereignty. Once again, we're willing to come to the table, have always been willing to come to the table to have diplomatic talks with Russia. However, Russia has consistently chosen other means. Therefore, Ukraine once again reaffirms its right to self-determination and is open to diplomatic talks and further peace process. Thank you.
Both of those things were a significant concern for Russia. I know that, Nazism was mentioned quite a few times in diplomatic remarks by Russian diplomats and also by Putin. And also the issue of Russophobia, that is less explicitly discussed because of the contention that Ukrainians are Russian. So it's more the argument that it's the Kiev regime and its followers that demonstrate Russophobia and Nazism. So from a Russian perspective, I would agree that Nazism is incredibly concerning and the West should be concerned as well. And Russia are taking steps to try and prevent that and reintegrate Russians into their homeland, essentially. So why the West has problems with Russia trying to address Nazism is another example of Western hypocrisy.
Just to respond to what my fellow colleague said, what has been done by Putin saying, oh, Nazism and Russophobia, it is just a discourse being used by Russia to delegitimize Ukraine. So that's just that. It's just discourse, pure rhetoric being used by Russia as a means to delegitimize Ukraine. So back to the question on the digital and technological means to defend itself. Yes, Ukraine has the means to defend itself. There has been many attacks by Russia in the digital domain, in the cyber domain. However, Ukraine has been able to defend itself from these attacks, and shown by Russia moving backwards over time and Ukraine reclaiming parts of its territory. I have to say that, yes, our country has the capability to use cyber tools to defend itself and protect our territory.
I just wanted to add two things, not necessarily from Russia's perspective. One, I think I don't know, a few weeks ago I would have said that the West would make sure that Ukraine has the technological capabilities to sustain itself. That's sort of something that NATO has taken upon itself in terms of providing supplies to Ukraine, including intelligence support. Now it's a little hard because the West is becoming more and more stretched as more conflicts arise. And there's also the big issue of donation and support fatigue in the West, which, you know, it's very exciting to help a new country, help a country when a new war breaks out. But as that drags on and on and on, it becomes the novelty wears off. And I think they get that fatigue also from seeing, yes, the position is being maintained or even some ground is being captured, but the war remains ongoing. So on another point, an issue that I think is big for Russia is the issue of morale, which is a major requirement in all war. Morale is easier to come by in religious warfare because usually there are, you know, religious motivators in that regard. But where one country is invading another country and not all of the invaders of the original country see the second country as their own, they can have some issues with morale. And I think we're really seeing that in Russia. And I think it's also one of the reasons that Ukraine has been able to, against all odds, hold its ground, because their motivation is defending their homeland, whereas Russia's motivation, some soldiers see it as, you know, doing what this oligarch tells them to do. So I think, yeah, that's also a major issue for Russia.
Yes, also additionally, just to add something outside of my role, like many individuals saw this war between Russia and Ukraine from a mile away. Russia has said over time, look, we do not want NATO and EU expansion. We don't want NATO and EU, and by extension, the US, by our borders. So many persons in academia saw this. However, the US continued to say, okay, no, we want them in our spheres of influence. And that was one of the reasons, in my opinion, why Russia said, no, we're gonna invade Ukraine to show them like we mean business and we're not, it's just not lip service.
Thank you so much, everyone, for today's session. And as we are talking about the digital war, I personally representing me with François will represent the role play about the Korean War, and our presentation is about the Korean War, Forgotten Conflicts, Enduring Consequences. And in this role play, I would be the North Korean, but as mentioned before, this is not necessarily connected to my personal thought. It's just because we would like to exercise what we have understood for this research and the war itself. So yeah, my name is Zumaro and I'm from Indonesia. And after my presentation, there will be François and he will be stands for the South Korean. Let's start. When we're talking about the war in Korea itself, I think we need to make sure why this presentation is coming out. So the objective of this presentation is actually to provide a clear and concise overview of the Korean War, focusing on its historical context and far-reaching effect it has had on the world. And the key learning that I personally would like to deliver after this presentation is the background history, which is the short one, and timeline, what was happening and what is still happening right now, and also the position of the North Korea, as I'm currently being the representative of the North Korea itself. So by the definition, the Korean War, often referred to the Korean conflict, this is involving two-sided. The first one is North Korea, which is backed by the Soviet Union and China. This is our part. And the South Korea, which is backed by the United States of America, and also most of them by the United Nations. The key idea of the conflict itself is it occurred between 1950 to 1953, and it is the root in the post-World War, the Second World War division of the Korean Peninsula. And the question is that why this issue is significant to be addressed. It is actually essential to provide an insight into the historical context and geopolitical consequences of the conflict. Then it can ensure the relevance for international relations and conflict resolution to the strategies. So the timeline from the 1950, this is the outbreak of the war, which involved the international intervention. And then in the 1953, there is the armistice. And it's actually ended in the ceasefire, but there is no formal peace treaty on it. And then for the cause of that, the peninsula is divided and separated by the demilitarized zone, which is called DMZ. And then until now, it's still ongoing tension, which the military has the tension between both countries, and this is affecting international diplomacy itself in East Asia. In 1991, inter-Korean dialogue has been done, and this is actually the high-level talks between North and South Korea to reduce tension in the peninsula. But in 2000, it was again the Inter-Korean Summit. This is actually the historic summit between the leaders of the North and South Korea. But then there still remains ongoing issue, which is the nuclear concerns. And this actually the international concerns about the nuclear weapons program from our side, which is the North Korean side. And as of now, from 2018 until the present moment, we still have the diplomacy inter-Korean, and there is several series of summits between North and South Korean leaders has been conducted, but until now we're still not having a middle ground to resolve the conflict. So was the conflict avoidable? There are 5 things from our side that triggers the Korean War. And we believe that it was because the first one is historical divisions. This is involving the division of Korea after the Second World War. And this is actually the ideological and political differences between Soviet-backed North and US-backed South. The second one is the Cold War tension. This is the rivalry between the US and Soviet Union again, and it is the great influence for the conflicts, because the both superpower actually engage in global struggle for to make this Korea become the battleground. And also we see that there is a lack of diplomacy. The diplomatic channels and efforts to find peaceful resolution were quite limited because both sides, both North Korea and South Korea, actually not having effective communication to solve and to find a compromise in the year leading up to the war. And then this is what we don't really stand for. We think this is one of the main causes that makes our country suffers. Actually, the international involvement. The United Nations, led by United States, this intervention to support South Korea is actually makes us not quite happy. So the international nature of the conflict itself become complicated because of that. And from our side, we of course would like to praise our leader, the North Korean leader Kim Il-sung, because he has the desire to unify the Korea, which we have the communist rule. And yeah, this is what we believe the best for both Korea. And our strategy is actually rounding around for this three main section. The first one is nuclear deterrence for regime security. We developed the nuclear weapons to serve as the potent deterrence against foreign military intervention, because we feel that we need to protect our regime from this intervention so that we can protect our sovereignty and stability. The second one is the asymmetric warfare and escalation control. We use the asymmetric warfare tactics, for example, including the cyber attacks and special operation forces and artillery placement near the South Korean borders. This actually to afford greater control over the level of risk and uncertainty, because we believe that until now we're still under control of the international intervention. So we need to take over the control so that we can reduce the risk and uncertainty from our country. And also, we use the cyber intelligence and espionage. This involvement, it's about the cyber intelligence and espionage activities in providing the regime valuable insight to the adversaries. It allows us to gather information and carry out economic espionage. And we certainly think that by this strategy, we can understand the potential gaining upper hand in negotiation and conflict. And so there is a consequences that we received from the intervention of the United Nations by the sanction and isolation. So the UN imposed sanction is really significant consequences for us, which impacting our economic development and self-reliance. The regime perceived that this sanction as unfair and as a form of economic warfare and to undermining our stability. And then we also feel that there is a constraint on our sovereignty. So our country believes that some of UN processes and resolution infringe to our sovereignty, particularly discussion regarding human rights record and nuclear program. So our regime views this as external interference, and this is not going to be good for our country, and it's against our internal affairs. So the conclusion that we would like to share here, our perspective on the consequences of the Korean conflict and its engagement with the UN processes are actually characterized by a delicate balance between sovereignty concern and diplomatic opportunities. It shaped the unique geopolitical position and national interest. By the challenging sovereignty and security, we would like to make sure that our standpoint that the United Nations processes often pose challenges to our sovereignty and security. This imposition of sanctions and discussion related to human rights record and nuclear program, we viewed it as infringement and to our internal affairs and security threat. So this is the cause why we need to make attentions and confrontational stance to gain back our sovereignty and security. And for the diplomatic opportunities and perception management, of course, we do see that UN processes as diplomatic opportunities to engage with international communities. But then again, if we see the solution for this in the future outlooks, we would like to see a positive future outlook by requiring recognition of our sovereignty, security guarantees, and economic incentive. Until we get these 3 points, we will not, we still think like one Korea under the Communist Party will be the best, because international intervention will not be one of the solutions. So that's pretty much from our concern as North Korean representative, and we would like to yield our time to facilitator or directly to South Korean representative. Thank you.
Today I'm going to try to speak as a representative of South Korea and trying to balance the rather explicit opinion which has been expressed by the other side. So in order to speak about the topic, we believe that it's extremely important to understand the historical context of the Korean War. And it's important to understand that Korea, throughout its history, has always been a country that, according to a proverb from Korea, is a shrimps between whales. in a sense that we are a country which is very small and which is surrounded by great powers, whether it's been Russia, the United States, Japan, and of course, China. So our entire history has been an ongoing struggle to trying to affirm our position in the world and our independence and our identity. But for all division, Korea and North and South Korea both share the same identity and have the same fundamental values derived from Confucianism and Buddhism. Now, what is essential to understand on this aspect is that those values promote a model of respect of the authority, of hard work, and of respect of the traditions, which is in no ways aligned with communism. So when you want to understand how communism can have emerged in a country which is fundamentally based on those values, there is no way it could have come from the inside. So it has to be from a foreign influence. And this is fundamentally the problem of North Korea, which is that the entire history of North Korea and the entire legitimacy of this government has been based on foreign influence. And the only choice that North Korean people ever had was to choose between following the order of Moscow or the order of Beijing. Now, to understand if the conflict was avoidable, the answer is as sad as it's simple. If Korea was the only country in the world, no conflict would have ever happened because we would have all had the same values and we would have found a way to solve the problem from the inside. But as Russia and later China wanted to extend their toxic ideology in Asia, they corrupted the mind of millions of Korean, creating division in our society that should never have existed. A power struggle between two ideological blocs. So now, if you take into account the entire context of the regions and the geographical position of Korea, Korea was in the center of a power struggle between two global power of relatives comparable powers, who both shared the ambition of extending their contradictory ideologies. In this context, there was no way for Korea to avoid becoming the realm of conflict between those ideologies, and the war was inevitable in the sense that each side would have necessarily supported a part of Korea to become either communist or capitalist. So now this is for the background, and this is in order to understand why the conflict happened in the first place. But now the bigger question which has to be asked is this conflict legitimate? And who is right in this conflict? And in order to reply this, it is essential to analyze three aspects of the question. Firstly, who is the inviters? If you want to see if a war is legitimate, look at who is striking first. In the case of North Korea, it's very obvious. The North Korea army was the first to strike South Korea in June 1950. And they were the first to attack civilians, to invade cities, and committing multiple war crimes. Now, the second aspect which has to be observed is which side has committed more human rights abuse. Now, we're not lying in our own history, and there is effective evidence that South Korea, especially during the military dictatorship, has committed some sort of human rights abuses. Yet, what is even more undeniable is that North Korea, for every single abuse committed by South Korea, committed 10 times worse. When South Korea was facing inequality, North Korea was facing famines. When South Korea was imprisoning some political opponent, North Korea was creating concentration camp. So there is no argument that can be made that South Korea has been worse in terms of human rights abuses than North Korea. And in that sense, the position of South Korea is legitimate in this conflict. Now, finally, the third element of the question which has to be asked is what do people want? And once again, the evidence points toward the South Korea being the only legitimate state. Firstly, because South Korea is a democracy, and even if we had a military dictatorship, it was fully reformed after 1987, and now Korea ranked among the best democracy in the world, first before the United States. While on the other hand, North Korea never had a fair election since its establishment, and today ranked third worst democracy in the world according to the Economist Index ranking. So if you look at those three aspects, who struck first, which one is more democratic, and which one has committed more human rights abuses, all point out to North Korea being the only legitimate government for the peninsula. Now, when it comes to conflict-specific element and the strategy employed by both sides, well, the strategy employed by the North Korean side were displayed by by North Korea. But when it comes to South Korea, it is important to understand that our strategy, unlike North Korea, do not rely heavily on military forces. Yes, we have military services, and yes, we've invested heavily in technological securities. But when it comes to the grand scheme of our strategy, all of our effort has been committed toward getting ourselves included in international liberal orders, making the rest of the world dependent on our heavy industry, in a sense that most of the countries in the world would support us in UN resolutions, and therefore would end up sanctioning North Korea. We also attempted to create a model of societies throughout our soft power policies that inspired millions to come to North Korea, to South Korea, and that have led many North Koreans to escape the country to come in ours. So our strategy now is less violent, less damageable to the people, and fundamentally more efficient in bringing wealth and legitimacy in the world stage. So now, is there any chance for the conflict to ever be resolved? And in order to understand this, it's also essential to see the recent historical development, because in the 1990s, there were signs of better relationship between the two Koreas. As mentioned by Zuma, there was several summits that were organized. And throughout the summit, there were signs of potential rapprochement between the two Koreas. And the reason why is because fundamentally the two Koreas need each other. There is no really any needs to explain why North Korea needs South Korea. North Korea is a failed state which is unable to provide any economic basic needs to its own people. But the reason why South Korea would need North Korea is because South Korea is also facing multiple problems in terms of aging populations, raising wages, and therefore, in order to remain competitive in the world stage and to maintain its efficient industry, it needs to support, it needs to have a low labor cost populations, it needs to have more populations, and it needs to have a bigger territories. Besides, North Korea has many natural resources, such as coal, which could be extremely useful for a country that like South Korea, which is clearly missing some of those resources. Therefore, it goes in all of South Korea fundamental interest to reunify with North Korea. And it's been a desire shared by both sides to lead toward reunification. As mentioned previously, this reunification would have to occur within our liberal capitalist values, as it is fundamentally those that align the most with our historical values and the only one that has ever helped us to guarantee our own independence. But in the long term, this is what both Korea wanted. And this almost was going in the right directions in the 1980s when two successful Korean summits were organized. But then it all started to collapse when President Bush, in a brilliant diplomatic effort, classified North Korea as part of the axis of evils, including in the country responsible for the 9/11, and therefore destroying years of effort of diplomatic resolution between the two Koreas. Now the situation is blocked, mostly because of foreign power influence that are each side is trying to support its own interest. But we believe that in the long terms, as Korea will continue to develop, and as North Korea will be increasingly reliant on foreign countries, they will realize that their fundamental interest lies in siding again with South Korea, and that if together we work, we could create an independent, strong, and sustainable state. Thank you.
So today, Edwina and I, we're going to present more about the conflict in Myanmar or Burma. It's a topic that it has been, or a conflict that has been forgotten recently, particularly since in the international sphere there are so many recent conflicts. However, I think it's quite important considering the situation of the civil society and also the geostrategic situation of Myanmar between India, China, and also within Southeast Asia. So without any further comments, well, this is a role play, so I will represent the junta, the military junta, and Edwina, she's gonna represent the National League Democratic with Suu Kyi as the main leader of it, that is the Nobel Prize. So first, we're gonna do like a very quickly background review. Starting from the independence in 1948, Myanmar emerged from the British colonial rule with high hopes and start with a parliamentary democracy. Therefore, however, we find a military coup d'etat in 1962 with the General Ne Win. Sorry for the Myanmar names, I'm not very fluent on it, so there's gonna be some mistakes on it. This military is gonna force a socialistic economy program, adopted isolationist foreign policy, and a new constitution that is gonna reinforce the power of the military junta, and is gonna take the military over the control of all the governments. Following this situation, there's gonna be a lot of severe economic and civil society crisis that is gonna lead into the 8888 uprising. That the military is gonna respond with a brutal crackdown. Next. Then we have the 1989 until 2070. During this time, there is some improvement. The government want to clean their image after the uprising. So they're gonna try to do like elections in 1990. Here is when Suu Kyi is gonna appear. However, because of the loss of the military during these elections, they are gonna continue with the dictatorship and put Suu Kyi and other democratic leaders into prison or house arrest. And the situation is not going to change that much, and we will have again some social movement like the Saffron Revolution in 2007. During this time, also to highlight that they create a new constitution in 2080 that is going to solidify the military control in the parliament and over some specific ministries in the government. Then we have a new election process in 2010, which is going to be called fraudulent, and it's not going to be accurate at all. And the Union Solidarity and Development Party, that is like the political party of the military junta, is going to win. Okay, yes. However, the interesting thing is that the president that is going to be designated by the army, President Thein Sein, is going to initiate reforms, including the release of political prisoners and relax the media censorship. That is going to pave the way for the nationwide 2015 elections, or 2015 elections, where in these occasions the Suu Kyi political party is already going to win. And during this time is the moment that it gains a lot of popularity with of Myanmar crisis with their ethnic minority groups or also guerrillas within the country. And we have the Rohingya crisis in the Muslim part of Myanmar. Then is your part, yeah.
Yeah, so in 2020, there's an election was again conducted, and this time the NLD actually became more popular and won by a landslide, which are 396 seats, which is 8 more seats compared to the 2015 elections, while the pro-military USDP only won 33 out of the 476 seats in parliament, which is 6 less compared to the 2015 elections. So the NLD became more open in its intention to reduce the power of the military with the support of the majority of the population of in Myanmar. Seeing that their power and control over the parliament is threatened, so after the election, the military claimed that the election was rigged and also tried to pressure the NLD to appoint the military general, Min Aung Hlaing, to become the president. So a few days after being turned down, the military actually staged a coup. In 2021, the National Unity Government, or the NUG, is also formed. The NUG is a pro-democracy shadow government that consists of mostly people who have been in the parliament, if not for the coup. So Aung San Suu Kyi, de facto leader of Myanmar, also become the state councillor and also become a part of the NUG. The NUG also has the People's Defense Force backing them up, consisting of armed ethnic groups that have been fighting against the junta for decades. The military coup also caused civil disobedience, protests, and armed resistance across the country. So up until January 2023, it has been reported that nearly 3,000 people have been killed by the military since the coup, with thousands more being detained as they are being labeled as terrorists. So currently, the situation in Myanmar seems to be at a stalemate. From the USDP side, they are trying to hold elections to legitimize their control over the country, with the violence still ongoing. The Sagaing region in Myanmar reportedly suffers from the worst form of violence, with nearly 6,300 homes and 19 townships having been burned down, as this region sees one of the strongest anti-junta protest movements in the nation. On the other hand, the NUG, despite being labeled as a terrorist group by the junta, gains more legitimacy internationally. Not only has the European Parliament voted to support for the NUG also has opened its office in South Korea, Australia, and Washington to reach out to officials and international diplomats. The state of emergency in Myanmar has continued till today.
Okay, so now we're gonna engage more in the roleplay, and I'm gonna present the military junta or Tatmata perspective. The current situation is that all our movement and all our engagement with this conflict is total legitimate by the Constitution of 2080. All the action we have taken in recent years have followed with the legal framework provided by the Constitution, and therefore we call for the international community to recognize us as the legitimate government. The primary cause for this conflict is the national election held in November 8 of 2020, which was, in our perspective, fraudulent. In these fake elections, the National League for Democracy won with 396 seats, and our party only gained 33 seats, which is highly suspicious. So afterwards, we conduct extensive research, and we discovered issues with voter lists, ballot envelopes, and political parties' compliance with the election rules during the election period, and over 10 million irregularities in voter lists across 314 townships were subsequently identified. So we raised all these questions. In response to the situation, we made a significant effort to address this problem through the special session in the Union Parliament. However, everything was rejected by the Speaker and the President of Myanmar. Unfortunately, for the citizens of Myanmar, the military, including the actual President Min Aung Hlaing, warned that the failure of these elections will mean we need to dissolve the government and enter into the state of emergency. That this follows the sections 40C and also the Article 417 of the Constitution of Myanmar. All our movement were, I repeat, legal and within the framework of the Constitution. So I don't know why there is so many criticism between Western countries and international sphere. We follow the Constitution first. We talked with the President of Myanmar. He didn't want to cooperate, so we need to implement a impeachment, and we need to talk with the Vice President at that time. That it was our friend. We didn't decide this, so he helped us to engage in this emerge of a state of emergency in the nation, and to help our nation to feel secure and to continue with the legal and regulated elections and our democracy. Okay, so regarding the situation, we believe that we are doing our best to continue in the legal way and to gain the access to all the regions of Myanmar and the acceptance of the international community to continue promoting our infrastructures Why is important, particularly since that the government of, the fake government of the National League of Democracy, they don't have any type of security, they don't have any type of experience at all, and they didn't have any history with a ceasefire or engagement with all these ethnic guerrillas as we do. And also, if the international community don't support us, they're gonna have a situation of like in the Balkans in Europe. Myanmar is gonna get broken in different states, and it's not gonna be good for any neighbor, neither for the international community in general. Pass. So our idea and what we have tried to engage during all these 3 years is to repeat the elections, continue working within the constitution. We tried to do it in 2013, this 2 months ago in August. However, we couldn't do it because of the lack of help and support from other parties, because we want to try to do election with multicultural, multi-party elections. However, the rest of the government don't want to cooperate. And also we don't feel that the international community is gonna help us during these elections. So we are gonna give up or postpone these new elections until new measures or the atmosphere is better for us. And that's all.
The National Unity Government is essentially a shadow government that is formed in response to the military coup that took place in Myanmar on February 1, 2021. So the military, or the Tamadao, actually seized power from us, the democratically elected civilian government, claiming without substantial proof that the November 2020 general elections was rigged. The coup led to the detention of many of our elected officials, including the state councillor Aung San Suu Kyi and the president Win Myint. For example, Aung San Suu Kyi has been arrested for a total jail time of 33 years, and reasons for arrest include possession of walkie-talkie. So this arrest triggered a lot of widespread protests and civil disobedience. And because of this, the state of emergency was also announced, and the military general Min Aung Hlaing took control over the country. In the aftermath of the coup, the elected lawmakers, activists, and representatives from ethnic minority groups who opposed the military takeover came together to establish the National Unity Government in order to uphold the principles of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law in Myanmar. So the vision of the NUG is to build a peaceful federal democracy union which guarantees freedom, justice, and equality. The NUG believes in and accepts 1. Democracy rights, gender equality, and basic human rights. 2. Equality and self-determination. 3. Collective leadership. 4. Diversity, social harmony, solidarity, and non-discrimination. And 5. Protection of minority rights. The formation of NUG represents a critical response to the military's attempt to undermine democratic governments and the rule of law in Myanmar. We serve as a symbol of resistance and unity against the military junta, highlighting the collective efforts of various political and ethnic groups to oppose the coup and work towards the restoration of democracy and civilian rule in the country. One notable progress of NUG from our predecessor is the inclusion of the minority groups, with one of the most marginalized groups, the Rohingya, actually receiving a position in political power. Ang Kwai Mo, who is a Rohingya, received a position as deputy to the Human Rights Cabinet. The National Unity Government has outlined several key objectives and priorities in its efforts to restore democracy and address the ongoing political and humanitarian crisis in the country. Some of the primary goals and demands of the NUG include 1. Restoration of democracy. 2. Human rights and civil liberties. 3. International support and recognition. 4. Inclusive political transition. And 5. Peace and stability. Overall, our objectives reflect a commitment to democratic governance, human rights, peace, and inclusivity, with a focus on addressing the urgent political, social, and humanitarian challenges facing the people of Myanmar. We also aim to eradicate the dictatorship and the 2008 Constitution and build the Federal Democracy Union by defeating the military junta. The key point from the Constitution that keeps military in power is that 25% of the parliamentary seats have to be appointed by the military, and 75% support is required for any constitutional amendment, which essentially gives the military a veto power. The NUG has also gained support over 50% of Myanmar, and despite the bad international reputation that Aung San Suu Kyi has gained due to the Rohingya crisis, she is still widely popular within Myanmar. This is why she still holds power as the state councillor in our newly formed NUG. So apart from the domestic influence, we also have been gaining international support, especially from the European Parliament. We also have international offices in Washington and Canberra, for example, although these countries have not acknowledged the NUG as the official government of Myanmar, and hence we still maintain presence in these countries in order to lobby for international support. The United Nations have also shown its support to us by encouraging the member states to ignore the military junta's plans for election and acknowledge NUG as the official government of Myanmar. There were also other constitutional, there are a lot of constitutional assurances that was built in the 2008 constitutions, as mentioned by my colleague representing the military junta, and we aim to eradicate that. So the NUG is legitimate because of a few reasons. One, it represents the will of the people of Myanmar as expressed in the November 2020 election. Two, the NLD won 396 out of 498 contested seats in the parliament. And three, 80% of all elected parliamentarians formed the NUG in consultation with a National Unity Consultative Council. So the four considerations for the NUG's strong claim to be the legitimate representative of the people are: one, seeking to replace government; two, being representative; three, being broad; and four, being sustainable. The people of Myanmar have also shown their refusal to accept the military junta and the SAC leadership, not only through armed conflict, but also through protests, labor strikes, and refusal to pay utilities and taxes, and also boycotts of military products. To share a bit about our predecessor, the National League for Democracy, the NLD was a prominent pro-democracy party in Myanmar founded in 1988 by Aung San Suu Kyi and also other activists. The NLD advocates for democracy, human rights, and the rule of law in the country. We have won landslide victories in a few elections, namely in 1990, 2015, and 2020, although the military junta refused to acknowledge the election results in both 1990 and 2020, resulting in the arrest of Aung San Suu Kyi and other political leaders after both elections. So post-2015 elections, in the few years that NLD was actually in power, the military junta's presence and power was actually almost undiminished. The event where we can see this clearly is the 2017 Rohingya crisis. Despite the NLD being in power, the military junta managed to carry out one of the deadliest ethnic cleansing in the history of Myanmar towards the Rohingya minorities in Rakhine State. This results in thousands being tortured and killed. And many experts believe that the NLD actually did not have power to stop the military from committing these atrocities. Due to the dominance of power of the military, the coup was able to happen and the short democracy collapsed. The NLD was reportedly dissolved by the military government in early 2023 due to the failure to meet the registration deadline for elections. We refused to take part in an election that we deem illegitimate. So currently, the NUG is still fighting against the military junta for democracy in Myanmar. We are both fighting to gain legitimacy both domestically and internationally, while the humanitarian crisis is still ongoing within the country. A UN expert on Myanmar crisis mentions that the number of people in Myanmar in need of humanitarian assistance has increased from 1 million to more than 17 million in 2023. So for this reason alone, the military junta should not be allowed to be the official government of Myanmar. Not only is the NUG inclusive of ethnic minorities in the country, but it also has both domestic and international legitimacy, which makes it a more suitable government for Myanmar compared to USDP. So on the basis of human rights, domestic and international legitimacies, we believe that NUG is the legitimate government for Myanmar. Thank you.
Personal opinion on this is that there is a big problem of developed economy on this, which is that we kind of lost the sense of proportions in how many people were willing to die in war. Because like, I mean, it's kind of crazy. For example, like France was involved in Mali extensively. And whenever there was one soldier dying, we were making like national funerals. And then for 2 days, people are complaining and there is documentary about the family of the guy. And as sad as it seems, war is very costly in terms of number of people dying, right? And when it comes to a conflict like Ukraine and Russia, we don't have data on the number, but it's clear that both sides have suffered tremendous loss, and we will probably never know the identity of most people who died. And I think the big problem of a lot of developing countries, and that's my personal opinion, is that we became a bit, and we are perceived a bit by the rest of the world as coward, in the sense that we are very happy to throw bombs from far away, to send drones, and to let a lot of people die from far away, as long as we don't lose anyone. But we don't kind of dare to send troops on the ground. And therefore, a lot of countries perceived us as like not daring to actually engage in a conflict. So I think this is a problem of a lot of developing countries, that we need to understand that war is not just about who has the biggest economy and who has the weapon. It's also about the commitment of the civilians to die in it. And I feel some places like Ukraine has it. I don't know if France, for example, would have it.
I think it also depends on how you define war. I think it was Clausewitz or someone said that war is a continuation of policy by other means. So you could argue in many instances that war already occurs economically and through cyber, through satellite, and the civilian casualty is sort of the end of that line, in that that's what really spurs people into action. At the end of the day, you can, slap on as many economic sanctions as you want, but I don't think anything will really make people jump in the same way that seeing civilians harmed by war does. Obviously, it would be, I think a lot of, in terms of guerrilla warfare, like they would rather just target military targets. But when you have civilians who are also engaging in the war and all sorts of things, it makes it very difficult. So yeah, I mean, it would be ideal if just drones could go up against drones, but I don't foresee that really being the end of the line for warfare. I just have a question for North Korea. You mentioned in your presentation that the ideal situation would be that the entirety of Korea is under the control of North Korea's ruling party. The international community looks at North Korea and sees a variety of humanitarian abuses, whether that be food shortages, mishandling of COVID, bad medical equipment and systems. How would you justify the statement that the entire population would benefit from a rule of North Korea when this is what we're seeing from an outside perspective?
Yeah, I do actually like expecting this kind of question. But then I think as I'm not the North Korean myself, and also like I'm not stands for that, I just like playing the role. I think what is the background of that statement is that is the ruling of the family. So they just would like to make the family becomes one of the ruler, like the only ruler. So the only thing that they see as internal is like without an intervention from the external one. So that's the most ideal country from their side. So I think this Kim's family will be the regulator of the country. I think that's what the most ideal perspective from the North Korean people. But then, as of my personal point of view, I think I would believe that your question would be my question as well. Because during my research as well, I was like, oh, this is counterproductive. Like, I don't know, like counter-argue with my argument. But then, yeah, so what I think is, efficient answer is that the Kim would like to rule as one whole family, as the Korean family. It's not the nation, it's the family, I think. I hope it's answered the question.
Yeah, I definitely, and I think as like for me coming from a democratic country, my instinct is to think of it in terms of the impact on the population, on the people, because that's generally how my country is ruled in general. Whereas, yeah, those ideologies aren't quite the same, so those interests aren't at the foreground.